The creaking of the stagecoach's wheels echoed down the dusty road that wound toward Copper Ridge. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the small Arizona town, where the shadows cast by wooden buildings offered the only refuge from the scorching heat. Matthew Collins watched from the porch of his hardware store as the carriage finally crossed Main Street, bringing with it a figure he never expected to see again. Matthew's heart skipped a beat when he recognized Sarah Parker getting off the stagecoach. She was no longer the naive young woman he had abandoned 3 years ago, but an elegant woman, dressed in fine clothes that rivaled those of San Francisco's wealthiest ladies. At his side, a tall, imposing man, who Matthew quickly identified as James Hawkins, the new sheriff who would arrive that week. Impossible, Matthew muttered to himself, his hands gripping the porch railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The last time he had seen Sarah, she was just the daughter of old John Parker, a farmer who was barely able to maintain his land. Now, she exuded an aura of refinement and confidence that left him disconcerted. The news of Sarah Parker's return spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. In a matter of hours, the whole city was talking about the return of the Parker girl and her apparent transformation. Some said she had inherited a fortune from a distant uncle in Boston. Others speculated about a successful marriage that had ended in tragedy. Matthew watched all this from the window of his shop, while his wife, Clara, daughter of the city's richest merchant, chattered endlessly about the new dresses she needed to order so as not to be left behind by the newcomer. His marriage, which should have been his financial and social salvation, had turned into a golden prison of appearances and constant demands. "Matthew Collins, can you hear me?" Clara's shrill voice brought him back to reality. "We need to do something about this. This woman, we can't allow her to come here thinking she can dominate our society." He just nodded, his thoughts wandering to that night 3 years ago when he had made his choice. The promise of a comfortable life with Clara had weighed more than his love for Sarah. Now, fate seemed to laugh at his decision, bringing back a transformed Sarah, apparently more successful than he would ever be. That same afternoon, Sheriff Hawkins made his first official appearance at the Copper Ridge Saloon. Matthew, sipping his whiskey in the far corner, couldn't help but notice how the lawman exuded natural authority. Hawkins didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, and his attentive eyes seemed to absorb every detail of his surroundings. "Gentlemen," Hawkins began, his deep voice echoing through the now silent saloon, "as you may know, I have been assigned to take the position of sheriff in Copper Ridge. Over the past few months, this town has been experiencing a series of robberies that need to be investigated and solved." Matthew felt an uncomfortable shiver run down his spine. The robberies had started about 6 months ago, always targeting the city's most prosperous merchants. His own store had been targeted twice, although the thieves were unable to take anything of significant value. The buzz in the saloon increased as Sarah entered, her elegant footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. She greeted Hawkins familiarly, completely ignoring Matthew's presence. The sheriff smiled at her in a way that made Matthew's blood boil. "Mrs. Hawkins," said one of the men present, "it is a pleasure to have you back at Copper Ridge." Matthew choked on his whiskey. Mrs. Hawkins? Had Sarah married the sheriff? The revelation hit him like a punch in the gut. But there was something else in her eyes, a shadow he knew all too well from the times they were close. Sarah kept secrets, and Matthew was sure of it. As the night progressed, the whispers and speculation increased. Sarah's fortune, her marriage to Hawkins, her mysterious transformation, all this fueled the sharp tongues of the inhabitants of Copper Ridge. But it was the words of an old miner, half drunk in the corner of the saloon, that caught Matthew's attention. "That girl," the man murmured. "I saw her in Carson City about 2 years ago. She wasn't that refined, but she was involved with big people, dangerous people." The miner's words planted a seed of doubt in Matthew's already troubled mind. What had really happened to Sarah during those 3 years? How had she obtained her fortune? And why had he chosen to return right now, when the city was facing a wave of crimes? At the end of that first night, Matthew staggered home, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. The cold look Sarah had given him as she passed him in the saloon made it clear that the past was not forgotten. Her presence in Copper Ridge was no mere coincidence, and Matthew had a nagging feeling that the secrets she carried with her could destroy not only his own life, but also the fragile balance of the small town. As he lay next to Clara, who was already asleep, Matthew realized that the return of Sarah Parker, now Mrs. Hawkins, marked the beginning of a new era in Copper Ridge. An era of revelations, revenge and redemption, where the sins of the past would come to take their toll with high interest. And he, Matthew Collins, was at the center of it all, caught between the love he abandoned and the choices he made. The next morning brought with it not only the typical Copper Ridge heat, but also an unusual bustle on the city streets. Sheriff Hawkins had called a meeting in the church hall to discuss the recent robberies, and virtually all of the local merchants attended, including Matthew Collins, who sat discreetly in the back of the room. Sarah Hawkins sat in the front row, her elegant posture contrasting with the simplicity of the room. Her navy blue dress, clearly imported from some big eastern city, caused a stir among the ladies present. Matthew couldn't take his eyes off her, even when Clara poked him in the ribs, visibly irritated by his distraction. "Robberies follow a pattern," Sheriff Hawkins explained, his deep voice echoing through the room. "They always occur on moonless nights, always targeting specific establishments. The thief, or thieves, know the city's routine well." Matthew felt a chill run down his spine when Hawkins mentioned that his store had been one of the targets. The sheriff seemed to look directly at him as he spoke, as if he knew something the others didn't. After the meeting, as the villagers dispersed, Matthew observed Sarah talking to Martha Wilson, the owner of the local inn. The two women seemed like old acquaintances, which was strange considering Sarah had never mentioned such a friendship in the past. "Mr. Collins?" A deep voice surprised him. It was Sheriff Hawkins. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about the incidents at your store." Before Matthew could respond, Clara intervened. "My husband has already told everything he knows to the former sheriff, Mr. Hawkins. There is nothing new to add." "Maybe there is, Mrs. Collins," Hawkins replied calmly, his eyes fixed on Matthew. "Sometimes seemingly insignificant details can make all the difference." Matthew agreed to meet the sheriff later at his office, ignoring Clara's disapproving look. As he walked back to the store, he couldn't help but notice Sarah entering the telegraph office. Something about his stealthy movements piqued his curiosity. In mid-afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets, Matthew went to the sheriff's office. To his surprise, he found not only Hawkins, but also John Parker, Sarah's father, sitting in a corner of the room. "Mr. Parker," Matthew greeted awkwardly, receiving only a cold nod in response. "Mr. Collins," Hawkins began, "did you keep a detailed record of the merchandise in your store at the time of the robberies?" "Yes, of course. I've always been meticulous about accounting." "And did you notice any discrepancies before the robberies? Any specific items that gradually disappeared?" The question took Matthew by surprise. Now that he thought about it, he had noticed small irregularities in the inventory of specific tools, weeks before the main thefts. There were some tools, crowbars, saws, mostly equipment that could be used to pick locks, Hawkins added. "Interesting." The sheriff exchanged a meaningful look with John Parker, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Matthew felt there was something bigger going on, something that involved Sarah in some way. "Mr. Collins," continued Hawkins, "do you remember a man named Frank Thorne?" The name hit Matthew like a punch in the gut. Frank Thorne had been a regular customer at his store 3 years ago, just about the time he abandoned Sarah to marry Clara. "Yes, he bought tools often. He disappeared from the city suddenly. And did you know that Frank Thorne was found dead in Carson City 2 years ago, with several stolen items in his possession? Matthew turned pale. He remembered the old miner's words in the saloon about seeing Sarah in Carson City. The pieces were starting to fall into place in disturbing ways. No, I didn't know. Mr. Collins? Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes piercing. I believe that the current robberies at Copper Ridge are connected with events of the past. Events that you may have witnessed without realizing it. At that moment, Sarah entered the office. His gaze met Matthew's for a brief moment, filled with indecipherable emotions. James, she said to her husband, I have received the telegram we have been waiting for. Hawkins nodded gravely. Mr. Collins, you may withdraw for now, but please remain available for further questioning. Matthew left the office with his mind in turmoil. The coincidences were too disturbing. Frank Thorne, Carson City, the stolen tools, Sarah's return. There was a dark story there, buried under 3 years of secrets and lies. When he returned to his store, he found Clara talking animatedly with other ladies in the city. They fell silent abruptly when he entered, but not before he heard Sarah's name mentioned. What did you find? Clara asked, as soon as the other women left. Nothing conclusive, Matthew lied, unable to share his suspicions with his wife. That night, as he closed the store, Matthew saw Sarah walking alone down the main street. Without thinking twice, he followed her discreetly. She stopped in front of the old abandoned warehouse where they used to secretly meet 3 years ago. Are you going to be following me for long, Matthew? She asked without turning around. We need to talk, Sarah. There's nothing for us to talk about. The past is dead and buried, just like Frank Thorne. The direct mention of the name made Matthew shudder. What really happened after I left? Sarah finally turned to face him, her eyes shining in the dusk light. You chose your path, Matthew. Now live with the consequences. Before he could respond, Sheriff Hawkins emerged from the shadows. Is everything okay here? Perfectly fine, darling, Sarah replied, her voice soft but full of meaning. Mr. Collins was already leaving. Matthew watched the couple walk away, their silhouettes blending into the gathering shadows of the night. He was sure now. Sarah hadn't returned to Copper Ridge just as the new sheriff's wife. She carried dangerous secrets with her, and he, Matthew Collins, was inexorably entwined in this web of mystery and revenge. The week following the meeting at the sheriff's office brought a subtle but noticeable change to Copper Ridge. The air felt heavier, thick with suspicions and secrets whispered in the dark corners of the saloon. Matthew Collins spent his restless nights rummaging through old memories, searching for clues that might connect the past to the turbulent present. One particularly hot afternoon, while organizing his store's inventory, Matthew came across an old ledger. Flipping through its yellowed pages, his eyes lingered on notes from 3 years ago, specifically Frank Thorne's frequent purchases. The pattern was clear now. Tools that could easily be used for break-ins. Looking for something specific, Mr. Collins? Sheriff Hawkins's voice startled him. The lawman stood in the doorway, his badge glinting in the light of the setting sun streaming through the window. Just taking inventory, Matthew replied, hastily closing the book. Interesting. My wife mentioned that you were always meticulous with your records. Hawkins approached the counter, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, especially when it came to Mr. Thorne's purchases. Matthew's heart quickened. Sarah talked about Frank Thorne? Sarah talks about a lot of things, Mr. Collins. Mostly about how certain people in Copper Ridge aren't exactly who they appear to be. Before Matthew could respond, Clara burst through the store door, her face flushed with excitement. Matthew, you won't believe it. The Richardson mansion was robbed last night. Hawkins immediately turned to Clara, his posture changing from casual to professional in an instant. "How did you know that, Mrs. Collins?" "Everyone's talking. They took the entire safe, with all of Mrs. Richardson's jewelry." Clara seemed almost satisfied when reporting on someone else's misfortune. "And they say they found this near the broken window." She held out a delicate lace scarf with the initials S.H. embroidered in the corner. Matthew's blood ran cold in his veins. S.H. Sarah Hawkins. The sheriff took the handkerchief carefully, examining it under the light. "Interesting. My wife reported some tissues missing a few weeks ago." "Ah, how convenient!" Clara couldn't contain her sarcasm. "Mrs. Collins," Hawkins' voice took on a clipped edge, "I suggest you be wary of innuendo, especially considering your own husband has had interesting connections in the past." Matthew felt Clara's accusing gaze on him. The sheriff waved goodbye briefly and left the store, leaving behind a heavy silence between the couple. "What connections, Matthew?" Clara demanded as soon as they were alone. "It's nothing, just don't lie to me. It has something to do with Sarah Parker, doesn't it? That time before our wedding?" Before Matthew could respond, a scream echoed from the street. They both ran outside, only to see Sarah Hawkins collapsing in her father John Parker's arms in front of the bank. "She just found out," someone in the gathering crowd commented, "about her husband, the previous one." Matthew instinctively moved closer, but John Parker's icy gaze kept him at a distance. The old farmer carried his daughter into Dr. Miller, followed closely by Sheriff Hawkins, who had quickly appeared on the scene. That night, in the saloon, rumors ran rampant. The bartender, more helpful than usual due to the amount of drink consumed, shared what he knew. Sarah's first husband had not died of natural causes, as everyone thought. He had been murdered in Carson City, and the prime suspect was none other than Frank Thorne. "But Thorne is dead too," commented one of the customers. "And who do you think killed him?" replied the bartender, lowering his voice. "They say Sheriff Hawkins was in Carson City at the time." Matthew left the saloon earlier than usual, his mind a whirlwind of theories and suspicions. On the way home, he saw a familiar figure near the old general store, Martha Wilson, the innkeeper, talking furtively to Sarah. Hiding in the shadows, Matthew managed to capture fragments of the conversation. "Are the documents safe?" Sarah asked. "Where they've always been," Martha replied. "But you need to be more careful. Matthew Collins is no fool." "Matthew made his choice a long time ago." Sarah's voice sounded bitter. "Now it's too late for him to care about the truth." The two women quickly separated, leaving Matthew with more questions than answers. He returned home finding Clara already asleep, or pretending to be. He sat in his favorite armchair, remembering the events that led him to abandon Sarah. At the time, it seemed like a purely financial decision. Marrying Clara meant security, social status, a guaranteed future. But there was more, something he had tried to bury deep in his memory. The whispered conversations between Sarah and Frank Thorne, the secret meetings he pretended not to see, the money that had begun to appear mysteriously in her hands. A noise at the window brought him out of his thoughts. It was just the wind, but as he approached to close it, he noticed a folded paper on the sill. When he opened it, he immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting. "Midnight, where it all began. Come alone." Matthew looked at his watch. There was 1 hour left. He knew he should ignore the note, that nothing good could come of that meeting. But the truth was that since Sarah's return, he had been trapped in a web of mysteries that he needed to unravel. He picked up his revolver, checked the bullets, and placed it in the holster. Whatever Sarah wanted to reveal, he would be prepared. Copper Ridge held too many secrets, and it was time for some of them to come to light. The night was exceptionally dark when Matthew left his home, moving silently through the deserted streets of Copper Ridge. The new moon made his drive to their meeting place even darker, the old abandoned barn on the edge of town where he and Sarah used to meet 3 years ago. The creaking of the wooden door echoed in the silence as Matthew entered. The smell of old hay and familiar dust brought back an avalanche of memories. It was there that he had kissed Sarah for the first time, and also where, months later, he had said that he could no longer see her. "You came." Sarah's voice emerged from the shadows, startling him. She sat on a pile of bales, a lit lamp at her feet, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You knew I would come," Matthew replied, keeping a calculated distance. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want you to know the truth before it's too late." She stood up, her elegant dress contrasting with the rustic surroundings. "About Frank Thorne, about Carson City, about everything that happened after you chose Clara." "Why now?" "Because the robberies at Copper Ridge are no coincidence, Matthew, and you're more involved than you know." Matthew's heart quickened. "What are you talking about?" Sarah walked to an old table where she deposited a leather folder. "Frank Thorne wasn't just a customer at your store. He was part of a gang that operated throughout the territory, a gang that you unknowingly helped equip. I never—" "Not consciously," Sarah interrupted him. "But all those tools you sold him? They were used in robberies all over Arizona, and when I found out, well, that's when everything started to fall apart." Matthew felt the weight of the revelation. "Why didn't you tell me at the time?" "I tried. That night, when you said you were going to marry Clara, I was about to tell you everything, but you didn't even give me a chance to talk." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Matthew remembered that night, Sarah desperately trying to say something, and he, so focused on his sensible decision, hadn't even heard her. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I went looking for evidence. James, Sheriff Hawkins, was investigating the gang in Carson City. We met when I was tracking Thorne." Sarah paused, a bitter smile on her lips. "He was the first man after you who truly saw me, Matthew, who understood my quest for justice. And your first husband?" "He was part of the gang. He married me to silence me, but he didn't know that I was already working with the law." Sarah opened the folder, revealing documents and photos. "When he found out, he tried to kill me. Frank Thorne killed him first, in a dispute over stolen money." Matthew approached to examine the documents. He recognized receipts from his own store, detailed notes on robberies, names of accomplices. "Why did you return to Copper Ridge?" "Because the gang is reorganizing. The recent robberies? They're just the beginning. They want to get back something they lost 3 years ago, something that's hidden somewhere in this city." "What exactly?" "A map," Sarah replied, taking a folded paper from her bodice. "A map showing the location of all the gold stolen by the gang. Frank Thorne hid it before he died, and only a few people know where to look." Matthew took the paper with shaking hands. It was a rough drawing of Copper Ridge, with markings at specific locations. His eyes widened as he recognized one of the marked points. "My store?" "Exactly. Frank frequented your establishment for 2 reasons: to get tools and to hide clues. Each location marked on this map has a part of the puzzle." A noise outside made them both startle. Sarah quickly put away the documents. "We can't continue this conversation here," she whispered. "You need to trust me, Matthew. For the first time in 3 years, I need you to trust me completely." "How can I be sure you're telling the truth?" "Because this time, I'm not alone. James knows everything, and we need his help to stop more people from dying." Before Matthew could respond, the barn door opened violently. Clara was standing there, an expression of fury and betrayal on her face. "So that's it?" she shouted. "Secret meetings with her? After everything my family did for you?" "Clara, it's not what you think," Matthew tried to explain. "No? Then explain why my husband is meeting a widow in the middle of the night." "Mrs. Collins, Sarah interjected calmly. "Your husband is assisting with an official investigation. If you could give us a moment—" "Investigation? Is that what they call it now?" Clara laughed bitterly. "Wait until my father hears about this." Matthew felt a shiver run down his spine. Clara's father, Edmund Wells, was one of the most influential men in the city. If he found out about this meeting— "Clara, please," Matthew begged. "There are things happening that you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she replied, backing away towards the door. "And you're both going to regret this." Before they could stop her, Clara disappeared into the darkness. Sarah and Matthew exchanged worried looks. "That complicates things," Sarah muttered. "What do we do now?" "Meet James first thing tomorrow. He'll know what to do." Sarah put the map away. "And Matthew, be careful. Not everyone in Copper Ridge is what they appear to be." As he walked home, Matthew felt the weight of his past and present choices. The truth Sarah revealed opened a door to a world of danger and intrigue he never imagined existed in his quiet town. And now, with Clara knowing about their secret meeting, time was quickly running out. Dawn brought with it palpable tension in Copper Ridge. Matthew had barely slept, tormented by his conversation with Sarah and Clara's explosive reaction. When he finally left his house, he noticed that several residents were watching him with suspicious looks. The gossip had clearly already spread. On the way to the sheriff's office, Matthew passed by his father-in-law, Edmund Wells's store. The merchant stood at the door, his normally cordial face now a mask of disapproval. Clara had certainly already shared her version of the previous night's events. "Mr. Wells, I can explain," Matthew began, but his father-in-law raised his hand, interrupting him. "Save your breath, Collins. I always knew you weren't worthy of my daughter. Now I have proof." Before Matthew could respond, a commotion on the main street caught his attention. A group gathered in front of the bank, where Sheriff Hawkins was examining a broken window. Matthew approached, his heart racing as he realized that another robbery had occurred during the night. "They took important documents," announced the bank manager, visibly disturbed, "including property records and land titles." Matthew noticed Sarah watching the scene from afar, her face a mask of concern. When their eyes met, she made a discreet gesture towards the sheriff's office. Understanding the message, Matthew waited a few minutes before heading there. Inside the office, he found not only Sarah and Hawkins, but also Martha Wilson, the innkeeper. The atmosphere was tense, full of secrets about to be revealed. The thieves knew exactly what to look for. Hawkins began, his tone grave. The theft of the documents was no coincidence. "They're looking for the deeds to the properties where Frank Thorne may have hidden the gold," Sarah explained, laying out the map on the table. "Each mark corresponds to a significant location." Martha Wilson cleared her throat, attracting everyone's attention. "There's something you need to know about Frank Thorne. He didn't go it alone in Copper Ridge. He had a local partner, someone who provided information on the most valuable properties." "Who?" Matthew asked, although a dark foreboding already warned him of the answer. "Edmund Wells," Martha replied, confirming her fears. "His father-in-law coordinated the entire operation in the city." The revelation hit Matthew like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly, several details began to make sense. Wells's insistence that he marry Clara, the sudden interest in his hardware store, the frequent business trips that coincided with robberies in other cities. "That's why you were investigating Thorne." Matthew turned to Sarah. "You discovered the connection to Wells?" "Yes," she confirmed, her eyes revealing old pain. "When I tried to warn you, Wells realized I knew too much. He was the one who orchestrated our breakup, using Clara as a pawn in his game." Sheriff Hawkins approached the window, watching the movement on the street. "Wells still maintains contact with former members of the gang. The recent robberies are an attempt to recover not only the gold, but also documents that could incriminate him. Clara must know everything, Matthew muttered, remembering his wife's erratic behavior over the past few weeks. Probably not, Martha interjected. Wells has always been careful to keep his family away from his shady dealings. Clara is as much a victim as you are, Matthew. A noise at the door interrupted the conversation. It was one of the deputies, panting and agitated. "Sheriff, we found something in the abandoned warehouse. You need to see it." The group quickly headed to the location. In the basement of the warehouse, partially hidden by loose boards, there was a trunk full of documents. Among them, letters exchanged between Wells and Thorne, detailing plans for robberies and division of assets. "Is this enough to arrest Wells?" Matthew asked, flipping through the evidence. "It would be," Hawkins replied, "if we could keep him in town long enough. But with the theft of the bank documents, he's probably already planning his escape." Sarah approached Matthew, his familiar scent awakening long-buried memories. "We need to act fast. Wells can't find out that we found this evidence." "Too late for that," a familiar voice echoed down the basement stairs. Clara was standing there, a revolver shaking in her hands. "Dad always said you'd be trouble, Sarah Parker. Or should I say, Mrs. Hawkins?" "Clara, put that gun down." Matthew tried to get closer to his wife, but she took a step back. "Don't come any closer. You don't understand. Dad did all this for the family. Every penny stolen went to secure our future, our position in society." "So you knew," Sarah said, her voice filled with compassion. "All this time, you knew what your father did." Tears began to stream down Clara's face. "He told me after Matthew and I got married. He said it was necessary, that sometimes we need to make difficult choices for the greater good." "There is no greater good in crime, Clara." Sheriff Hawkins spoke calmly, moving imperceptibly toward her. "Your father destroyed lives, including your own. He's planning to leave town tonight," Clara revealed, the revolver still pointed at the group. "It will start over somewhere else, far from here." "We can't allow this." Sarah stepped forward. "Many people have suffered, Clara, including you." Clara's moment of hesitation was all Sheriff Hawkins needed. In one quick movement, he disarmed her, while Matthew ran to support his crying wife. "Matthew," Sarah called, her voice urgent. "Wells intends to escape tonight. Knowing him, he must have planned one last hit before leaving." "The bank's shipment of gold," Martha Wilson exclaimed, "arrived this afternoon at the stagecoach." Sheriff Hawkins quickly put together a plan. Clara would be kept in custody for her own protection while they set a trap for Wells and his cronies. As they climbed from the basement, Matthew realized he was at the center of a much larger web than he imagined. His marriage, his store, his entire life in Copper Ridge had been built on lies and manipulation. Now, with the truth exposed, there was only one path left to follow, even if it meant facing his own father-in-law in a confrontation that promised to forever change the city's fate. The sun began its descent over the horizon as Matthew, Sarah, and Sheriff Hawkins finalized preparations to intercept Edmund Wells. The plan was simple, but risky. They would let Wells know about the arrival of the gold shipment, but they would secretly change the stagecoach's route. "He'll have men watching every corner of Copper Ridge," Hawkins explained, marking strategic points on the city map. "We need to be smarter than them." Matthew watched Sarah, who was hunched over the sheriff's office desk, her fingers tracing possible escape routes. She had exchanged her elegant dress for more practical clothes, riding breeches and a leather shirt, reminding him of the determined young woman he had met years ago. "Wells was always meticulous in his plans," Matthew commented, recalling the years working closely with his father-in-law. "He wouldn't try something as obvious as a stagecoach robbery unless it's a distraction," Sarah added, her eyes meeting Matthew's. "Gold is not the true goal. Hawkins frowned. The bank documents. He needs to destroy them before he escapes. A deputy hurriedly entered the office, interrupting the conversation. "Sheriff, Mrs. Collins is asking to see her husband." Matthew felt his stomach drop. Clara was detained in one of the cells, more for her protection than as a prisoner. Hawkins nodded, allowing Matthew to go over. Clara was sitting on the small bed in the cell, her eyes red from crying. When he saw Matthew, he stood up quickly. "You need to listen to me," she whispered urgently. "Dad, he's not alone in this. There are important people involved, people you can't even imagine." "What are you talking about, Clara? Why do you think he was so insistent on our marriage? His store was perfect as a front for their operations. And now—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Now they can't afford to leave witnesses." A shiver ran down Matthew's spine. "Who are they, Clara?" "Judge Morrison, for starters, and Reverend Phillips. There are others, but these are the ones I know for sure." The revelation hit Matthew like a punch in the gut. Judge Morrison was the most respected man in Copper Ridge, responsible for justice throughout the county, and Reverend Phillips had officiated his wedding to Clara. Returning to the sheriff's office, Matthew shared Clara's information. Sarah paled when she heard the names. "That explains how they always managed to escape justice," she muttered. "The judge dismissed the cases, and the Reverend provided perfect alibis through the church. And it also explains why Wells is so confident in his escape," Hawkins added. "He has support at the highest levels in the city." The distant sound of horses' hooves interrupted the conversation. Martha Wilson rushed into the office. "The stagecoach is arriving, sooner than expected." "Damn it," Hawkins swore, grabbing his rifle. "They changed the schedule without telling us. Matthew, you and Sarah are going to the bank. If our theory is right, Wells will try to use the confusion to retrieve the compromising documents." Matthew and Sarah ran through the side streets of Copper Ridge, avoiding being seen. The setting sun cast long shadows across the alleys, turning every suspicious movement into a possible threat. As they approached the bank, they saw two figures sneaking around the back of the building. Matthew immediately recognized Reverend Phillips's burly silhouette. "They're already here," Sarah whispered, pulling a small pistol from the holster hidden in her boot. "We need to stop them from destroying the evidence." "There's a back entrance," Matthew said, "only used by bank employees." Moving silently, they made their way around the building. The back door was ajar, confirming his suspicions. Inside the bank, muffled voices echoed from the main office. "Quickly, we need to burn everything down before Hawkins comes back," Judge Morrison's voice ordered. "Wells should already be handling due diligence." Matthew started to move forward, but Sarah stopped him with a gentle touch on the arm. His eyes communicated a silent plan. She pointed to the tall windows of the bank, indicating an alternate route. While Sarah distracted the men through the main entrance, Matthew climbed to one of the windows. His heart beat furiously in his chest when he finally got a clear view of the office. Judge Morrison and Reverend Phillips were poring over a stack of documents, sorting through those that needed to be destroyed. A small fire was already starting to form in a metal can. "Stop!" Sarah's voice boomed from the bank entrance. "Get away from those documents!" The two men turned around, surprised. Reverend Phillips pulled out a gun, but Sarah was already prepared. A well-aimed shot hit the religious man's hand, causing him to drop the pistol. Matthew took advantage of the distraction to leap into the office, his own gun pointed at Judge Morrison. "It's over," he declared. "Clara told us everything." "You don't understand, Collins," Morrison growled. "This is bigger than you think. There are powerful people involved, people who can make your life hell." "My life has already been hell since I got involved with your organization," Matthew replied bitterly. "Time to do the right thing." The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the city. The stagecoach was under attack. Sarah held her weapon steady, preventing any movement from the two men. James will take care of Wells, she assured Matthew. Our part is to ensure that this evidence survives. The sun had completely disappeared when Sheriff Hawkins finally returned to the bank, bringing with him a handcuffed Edmund Wells and several of his captured men. The gold is safe, Hawkins announced, and it looks like you guys were successful too. Matthew watched as deputies took Judge Morrison and Reverend Phillips to jail. Sarah was by his side, her presence a constant reminder of how their lives had intertwined in unexpected ways. What happens now? He asked, more to himself than to her. Now, Sarah replied softly, we begin to rebuild Copper Ridge, this time on honest foundations. Night had fallen over the city, but for the first time in a long time, the shadows seemed less threatening. The future was still uncertain, but Matthew knew he was finally on the right side of history. The next morning at Copper Ridge dawned with different weather. The city, normally bustling early in the morning, seemed subdued, as if its inhabitants were still processing the events of the previous night. The arrest of Judge Morrison, Reverend Phillips, and Edmund Wells had shaken the foundations of the community. Matthew Collins watched the street through the window of his store, which he had decided not to open that day. The last 24 hours had completely transformed his life, his marriage, his position in the city, his certainties. Everything was in question. I should be resting, Sarah's voice surprised him. She was standing at the door carrying a folder of documents. James spent all night interrogating Wells and the others. How's Clara? Matthew asked, noticing the deep dark circles on Sarah's face. Better than anyone could have expected. Martha Wilson is with her in the cell, helping her deal with everything. Sarah approached, placing the folder on the counter. But I didn't come here to talk about Clara. Matthew examined the documents Sarah had brought. They were detailed records of Wells' operations, names, dates, amounts stolen, and an extensive list of accomplices in several cities in the territory. This goes beyond Copper Ridge, he murmured, flipping through the pages. Wells built an entire network of respectable criminals. And now they're all panicking, Sarah confirmed, her fingers lightly brushing Matthew's as she pointed to a specific name on the document. Richard Blackwater, the banker from Silver Creek. He was responsible for laundering the money from the robberies. I know Blackwater. Matthew frowned. He regularly came to Copper Ridge for meetings with Wells. I always thought it was legitimate business. Nothing involving your father-in-law was legitimate, Matthew. Sarah's voice softened. You couldn't have known. Wells was meticulous about keeping up appearances. The sound of horses' hooves interrupted the conversation. Through the window, they saw Sheriff Hawkins arriving with two of his deputies. His face was serious. We have problems, he announced as soon as he entered the store. Wells managed to get a message out before he was arrested. Blackwater is gathering men at Silver Creek. For what? Matthew asked, although he already suspected the answer. To keep the documents from getting to federal court, Sarah replied, her hand instinctively touching the gun in her holster. If this evidence is presented, the entire criminal network will be exposed. Hawkins spread a map on the counter. The federal judge will arrive in 3 days. We need to keep Wells and the documents safe until then, but Copper Ridge is no longer safe. Blackwater has infiltrated men in the city. Where are we taking them? Matthew asked, surprising himself with his use of let's go. When had he decided to get so deeply involved in this situation? Fort Apache, Hawkins pointed on the map. It's the only place safe enough and with federal troops to protect us, but the journey won't be easy. 2 days of riding through Apache country, Sarah calculated. Blackwater will certainly have men watching the main routes. That's why we won't be using the main routes. Hawkins smiled slightly. Matthew, you know this region well. I need you on this mission. Matthew felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Participating in this escort meant definitively abandoning your previous life, becoming a target for men like Blackwater. And Clara? He asked, thinking about his wife. She will be safe here with Martha and my most trusted deputies, Hawkins assured. Actually, she was the one who suggested your name for the mission. She said you know trails that not even the Apache use anymore. Sarah watched Matthew closely, waiting for his decision. There was something in his eyes, no longer the old hurt, but a kind of cautious hope. "When do we leave?" Matthew finally asked. "At dusk," Hawkins replied. "The fewer people who know, the better. We'll take Wells with us. He's our best insurance should we encounter trouble with the Blackwater men." The next few hours were of silent preparation. Matthew gathered supplies, checked his weapons, and prepared the toughest horses he had in his stable. Sarah helped him, working in natural sync with him, as if the years of separation had never existed. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, as they adjusted the saddles. "You've already risked a lot by getting involved so far." "Yes, I do," Matthew replied, stopping what he was doing to look at her. "For years I lived a lie, Sarah. I helped Wells without knowing it. I hurt people. I hurt you. It's time to do the right thing." The sun was beginning to set when the small group gathered at the back of the jail. Wells, handcuffed and gagged, was placed on one of the horses, closely guarded by two of Hawkins' trusted deputies. The documents were distributed among everyone to minimize the risk of loss. "Remember," Hawkins instructed in a low voice, "if we are attacked, our priority is to get to Fort Apache with the documents. Wells is important, but the evidence is essential." Matthew took one last look at his store, at the city that had been his home for so many years. Beside him, Sarah also seemed lost in thought. "Regret?" he asked softly. "Having come back?" "No." She smiled, that smile he had missed so much. Some things needed to be resolved. The group departed silently into the rising night, leaving Copper Ridge behind. Ahead of them, the wild territory stretched out like a sea of shadows and dangers. Matthew knew that the next 2 days would define not only the future of justice in the region, but also his own destiny. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. The dawn painted the sky with shades of pink and gold as the group crossed the narrow gorge that Matthew had known since he was a child. The rough terrain made progression difficult, but offered cover against possible pursuers. Edmund Wells, still tied up and under constant surveillance, watched every movement with calculating eyes. "We need to stop to water the horses," Hawkins announced in a low voice, motioning to a small clearing protected by tall rocks. 15 minutes, no more." Matthew dismounted, taking advantage of the moment to stretch his aching legs. Sarah approached, offering him a canteen of water. "Are you thinking the same thing as me?" she murmured, her eyes sweeping over the surrounding terrain. "That it's too quiet?" Matthew replied, noting the absence of the usual morning sounds of the desert. "Yes, I noticed it too." Sheriff Hawkins was already on alert, his hand resting casually on his holster. The two deputies who accompanied them took up strategic positions, while Wells showed an enigmatic smile that didn't go unnoticed by Matthew. "He knows something," Matthew whispered to Sarah. "Look at him." Before Sarah could respond, the silence was broken by the report of a rifle. One of the deputies fell, hit in the shoulder. Chaos ensued instantly. "Ambush!" Hawkins shouted, pulling Wells behind a rock as bullets ricocheted around them. Matthew grabbed Sarah by the arm, dragging her to the cover of a rocky outcrop. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to locate the source of the gunshots. "Blackwater!" Wells shouted, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Did you really think he wouldn't be ready, Hawkins?" "Shut up!" the sheriff ordered, pressing his gun against Wells' back. Sarah drew her pistol, her narrow eyes focusing on the rocky rises above them. I counted at least 5 shooters. They're surrounding us. Matthew surveyed the terrain, his mind working quickly. There's an underground passage, he said quietly. An old abandoned mine. The entrance is about 50 yards from here. How do you know that? Hawkins asked, keeping Wells in his sights. My father was a miner. He showed me all the passages in this region before he died. A new volley of gunfire forced the group to duck. The injured deputy managed to crawl over to them, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. We have no choice, Sarah decided. It's our only chance to leave here with the documents. Hawkins nodded. Matthew, you lead. Sarah, cover our rear. I'll take care of Wells. The group began to move cautiously, taking advantage of every available cover. Matthew could hear Blackwater's men approaching, their voices echoing among the rocks. Hand over Wells and the documents, a deep voice ordered. We don't want any more blood. Liar, Sarah muttered, shooting accurately at a shadow that moved to her left. A scream of pain confirmed that he had hit the target. Matthew guided the group through the treacherous terrain, each step calculated to avoid exposure. The mine entrance was partially covered by dry bushes, almost invisible to those who didn't know where to look. There, he pointed, crouching to remove the vegetation. A shot grazed his head, causing him to fall to the ground. Sarah returned fire immediately, providing cover as Hawkins dragged Wells toward the mine entrance. Quickly, the sheriff ordered, pushing Wells into the dark passage. The injured deputy was next, followed by Hawkins. Matthew motioned for Sarah to come closer, keeping an eye on the shooters above. They're coming down, Sarah warned, reloading her gun with precise movements. We don't have much time. Matthew took out his revolver, shooting at the figures moving between the rocks. Go! I'll cover you! Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting his. Don't you dare die here, Matthew Collins. She ran to the mine entrance, while Matthew continued shooting to keep pursuers at bay. When his last bullet was fired, he threw himself into the passage, rolling to avoid the shots that followed him. The darkness of the mine enveloped them like a cloak. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. Matthew took a match from his pocket, lighting it to light the way. This way, he indicated, guiding the group through the narrow tunnel. This pass leads to the other side of the mountain. They don't know this exit. How can we be sure? The injured deputy asked, his voice weak from blood loss. Because my father was the last man alive who knew this place, Matthew replied, his voice thick with certainty. And he only told me. Wells let out a bitter laugh. You've always been full of surprises, Collins. Too bad you wasted your talent by being honest. Shut up, Sarah ordered, poking Wells with her gun. You've already caused enough trouble. The group slowly advanced through the tunnel, the only sound being their breathing and the occasional drip of water on the stone walls. Matthew led the way, his mind going over the mental map his father had left him. After what seemed like an eternity, a faint light began to seep through cracks in the rock. The exit was close, leading to a sheltered valley where they could reorganize their journey to Fort Apache. We did it, Hawkins muttered, checking on the injured deputy. But we need to treat this wound soon. Matthew looked at Sarah, noticing how exhausted but determined she looked. Her eyes still shone with the same strength that had captivated him years ago. You were right, he said softly. Some things needed to be resolved. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. And we're not done yet, Matthew. We're not done yet. The group emerged from the mine into daylight, leaving behind the distant sounds of their pursuers. The journey to Fort Apache would still be long and dangerous, but now they had a real chance of success. And for Matthew, every step alongside Sarah seemed to bring him closer, not only to justice, but also to a redemption he didn't even know he sought. The valley where the group emerged from the mine offered a privileged view of the surrounding territory. Matthew, still on the lookout for possible pursuers, helped the injured deputy get comfortable under the shade of a gnarled oak. Sarah and Hawkins kept Wells under constant surveillance as they pored over documents to ensure nothing had been lost during the escape. "We need to treat this wound before we continue," Hawkins stated, observing his deputy's pale face. "Matthew, how long to Fort Apache from here? If we keep a good pace and don't encounter any more problems, we can make it by nightfall," Matthew replied, trying to ignore Wells's piercing gaze. Sarah tore off part of her petticoat to make makeshift bandages. As he worked on the deputy's wound, Wells began to laugh softly, a sound that made everyone turn to him. "You guys really think you know the whole story, don't you?" he teased, his eyes fixed on Matthew. "Your father didn't die in a mining accident, Collins. He discovered something he shouldn't have." Matthew felt his blood run cold in his veins. "What are you talking about?" "Why do you think I was so insistent on your marriage to Clara? It wasn't just because of your convenience store." Wells straightened up, even with his hands cuffed. "Your father found something in that mine, something worth more than all the gold we've ever stolen." Sarah stopped what she was doing, her attention completely focused on Wells. Hawkins also approached, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Continue," the sheriff ordered. "Maps," Wells revealed, savoring every word. "Old Spanish maps, showing locations of unexplored silver mines. Your father found them, but was too honest to use the information. So, accidents happen." Matthew lunged at Wells, only being restrained by Sarah's firm arm. Did you kill my father?" "Me? No, not personally. But Blackwater, well, he was always more practical at solving problems." Wells smiled bitterly. "The maps were in your store's safe all this time, Collins, hidden among old papers you never bothered to look at." Sarah looked at Matthew, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why the robberies started at your store. They were looking for the maps." "And that's why Clara was chosen to marry you," Hawkins added, "to keep him under control while they searched." Matthew staggered back, his legs weak from the weight of the revelations. His entire marriage, his entire life in recent years had been built on an even bigger lie than he imagined. And Sarah? Sarah had returned not just for revenge, but because she had discovered the truth about her father's death. "Did you know?" he asked her, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I discovered part of the story in Carson City," she replied softly. "That's why I approached James. We needed hard evidence to bring down Wells and Blackwater's entire organization." The injured deputy groaned, bringing everyone back to the urgent reality of their situation. Hawkins checked the horizon with his spyglass. "We have company arriving," he announced. "At least 12 knights, coming from the north." "Blackwater," Wells smiled. He was always persistent. Matthew looked at the narrow passage that led to the valley. It was his territory, known since childhood. "There's another way out, an Apache trail that few know about. We can lose them, but we need to separate." "No," Sarah protested immediately. "It's exactly what they want." "It's our only chance," Matthew insisted. "You and Hawkins take the documents and the injured deputy to Fort Apache. I'll take Wells the other way, luring Blackwater away from you." "And why would we do that?" Hawkins asked suspiciously. "Because Wells hasn't revealed everything yet," Matthew replied, glaring at his ex-father-in-law. "And because he knows that only I can find those maps now." Wells laughed again. "Smart, Collins. Smarter than I thought." Sarah approached Matthew, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm not going to let you do this alone. Not after everything we found out." "I have to do this, Sarah." He touched her face gently. "For my father. For us. For all the truth that was buried 3 years ago." Hawkins watched the two interact for a moment, before making his decision. "You have until dark to get to Fort Apache. If you don't show up by then, I'll come back looking for you." The sound of approaching hooves made the need for action more urgent. Quickly, the group organized itself. Hawkins helped the injured deputy mount, while Sarah transferred the most important documents into her own bag. "Don't die," she ordered Matthew, her voice firm despite the suppressed emotion. "I don't intend to," he replied, allowing himself a brief smile. "We still have a lot to resolve." Matthew mounted his horse, pulling Wells to mount behind him. Before leaving, he looked at Sarah one last time, recording in his memory the strength and determination in her eyes. "East," he instructed Hawkins. "Follow the course of the dry creek. The Apaches call that path the Spirit Trail. No one will follow you there." With one last wave, the group separated. Matthew led his horse west, toward the Rocky Mountains where he had grown up. Wells, still smiling, muttered softly, "You really are your father's son, Collins. Stubborn to the end." Matthew tightened his grip on the reins, the sounds of the pursuers getting closer. "You didn't know my father, Wells, but you'll know me very well before this day is over." The sun began its descent into the sky, casting long shadows across the wild country. Somewhere ahead, answers awaited, and Matthew Collins was determined to find them, no matter the cost. The sun was approaching the horizon as Matthew guided his horse through a narrow gorge, the animal's hooves echoing against the rocky walls. Wells, still tied up and riding behind him, maintained an unusual silence, as if calculating every moment. "Where exactly are you taking me, Collins?" Wells finally asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. "To the place where it all began," Matthew replied dryly, turning the horse toward a barely visible trail. "The mine where my father died." The distant sound of horses reached them, making Matthew quicken his pace. Blackwater and his men were approaching, just as he had planned. Every meter they traveled toward the old mine was a meter more that Sarah, Hawkins, and the documents gained on their journey to Fort Apache. "Do you really think you're going to find something there?" Wells teased. "We've searched that place dozens of times since your father died." "But you didn't know my father like I did," Matthew replied, an enigmatic smile appearing on his lips. He had his own secrets. The mine entrance loomed ahead of them, partially covered by years of erosion and wild vegetation. Matthew dismounted, pulling Wells with him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rocks, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to dance on the canyon walls. "Blackwater!" Wells suddenly shouted, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. "We're here!" Matthew pressed his revolver against Wells' back. "One more scream, and you won't live to see what you're looking for." The sound of approaching horses grew more intense. Matthew pushed Wells into the mine, lighting a lamp he had brought. The main tunnel stretched out before them, its walls scarred from years of excavation. "Third fork to the right," Matthew muttered to himself, recalling the instructions his father had left in a journal he had discovered only the night before, hidden in a false bottom of his old dresser. "You're bluffing," Wells said, stumbling along the abandoned trails. "There's nothing here but empty tunnels and bitter memories." Matthew ignored the comment, continuing to guide Wells through the tunnels. The air was heavy with decades of secrets and unresolved tragedies. Each step took them deeper into the darkness, closer to the truth their father had protected with his life. Voices echoed from the mine entrance. Blackwater and his men had arrived. Matthew quickened his pace, forcing Wells to follow him through a narrow passage few knew about. "Here." Matthew stopped abruptly, shining his light on a seemingly solid wall. "Watch the sunrise, son," he murmured, repeating the last words his father had written in the diary. With skillful fingers, Matthew pressed a series of stones in a specific sequence. A soft click echoed in the tunnel, and a small opening revealed itself in the wall. "Impossible," Wells whispered, his wide eyes fixed on the secret compartment. Matthew reached inside the opening, pulling out an aged leather tube. Inside, just as his father had described, were maps of the silver mines, not copies, but the Spanish originals, with detailed notes in the margins. "Your father was smarter than we knew," Wells admitted, a mixture of admiration and bitterness in his voice. "And more honest, too," Matthew replied, tucking the maps into his coat. He could have sold that information, gotten rich, but he chose to protect it because he knew what men like you would do with it. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Matthew pushed Wells behind a pile of rubble just as Blackwater and 3 of his men appeared at the tunnel entrance. "Wells?" Blackwater called, his voice reverberating off the walls. "Collins? We know they're here." Matthew checked his revolver, 4 bullets left. Not much to face 4 armed men, but it would have to be enough. "Richard!" Wells shouted, ignoring Matthew's earlier threat. "The maps! Collins found them!" The shooting began without warning. Matthew pushed Wells to the ground, using the rubble for cover as bullets ricocheted off the mine walls. The deafening echo of the gunshots made it impossible to determine exactly where each man was. "Hand over the maps!" Blackwater demanded. "There's no way out of here." Matthew smiled in the dark. There was always a way out. His father had made sure of that. With a quick movement, he reached a lever partially hidden among the rocks. "You're wrong, Blackwater," he shouted. "There is always a way out." He pulled the lever with all his might. A dull boom reverberated through the mine, and the roof of the tunnel began to collapse between them and their pursuers. Matthew grabbed Wells, dragging him to a side tunnel his father had prepared as an escape route. "No!" Blackwater shouted, his voice being swallowed by the sound of the mine collapsing. Matthew and Wells emerged through a barely visible opening in the side of the mountain, just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In the distance, the dust raised by the collapse rose like a curtain in the still desert air. "It's over," Matthew said, handcuffing Wells to an abandoned wooden post. "Blackwater is dead, its secrets are buried, and the maps are finally safe." "What are you going to do to me?" Wells asked, for the first time looking truly defeated. "I'll wait. Sheriff Hawkins will be back to look for us at nightfall." Matthew sat on a nearby rock, watching the sun set. "And then you will face the justice my father never had the chance to see." The hours dragged by as the shadows lengthened across the desert. When the first star appeared in the sky, the sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Matthew stood up, recognizing the silhouettes of Sarah and Hawkins against the night sky. "The documents?" he asked, as soon as Sarah dismounted. "Safe at Fort Apache," she replied, her eyes scanning him for injuries. "What about maps?" Matthew took the leather tube from his coat. "Exactly where my father said they would be, along with all the truth he died to protect." Sarah moved closer, touching his face gently. "Your father would be proud, Matthew." "And what happens now?" he asked softly, covering her hand with his. "Now," she smiled, that smile he had loved from the first moment. "We begin again. No lies, no secrets, just the truth that has always been between us." Sheriff Hawkins approached, handcuffing Wells appropriately. "It's a long drive to Fort Apache," he commented, "and we have a lot of stories to tell the federal judge." Matthew watched as Wells was placed on a horse, finally facing the consequences of his actions. The sun had completely disappeared, but the sky still held a last trace of light, like a promise that after the deepest darkness, a new day always dawns. "Let's go home," he said to Sarah, mounting his horse. And for the first time in 3 years, the word home had a completely new meaning.